Well, I think we can get started. So it's my pleasure to introduce Devansh. Devansh has been a PhD student in my lab for the past 2 years, got advised by Inoue in MSNE. But if I were to describe Devansh, I would say that he's a force of nature. He has been working on incredible amount of topics. I would say that his work is equivalent to 2 PhDs. And that's not because I set that higher bar, it's just that he's very self-motivated. Probably his PhD is setting a new record in terms of length for my lab. So out of the 30 PhD students have graduated, your thesis is definitely the longest. So thank you for keeping all the readers very busy in through thesis. And as I said, he has been working on a number of different topics, both on the methodological side and the application side. But essentially, he's been working on pushing the state of the art on the design and operation of the sociotechnical systems, like, for example, transportation networks, power networks, with a focus on ensuring a fairness and equitability of operations. So what we're going to talk to you today is just a very small subset of all the things that he has been doing. And yeah, look forward to your talk.
Great. Thank you so much, Marco. And thank you so much, everybody, for being here today. And also to the ones that are there virtually on Zoom. So I just want to give a quick overview of how the defense will run. So we'll start with a public session lasting roughly about an hour. And then we'll move to a private session where it'll just be me and the thesis committee members. Okay. So with that, let me get started. So today I'll be talking about some of the work I've done during my PhD on algorithmic sustainability for resource allocation in large-scale socio-technical systems. Oh, I should click here. Great. So just to set some context, we very much live in a resource-constrained world, be it the limited access to energy resources, the limited availability of road space, which leads to quite poor traffic congestion outcomes, or even the limited availability of vaccines during the pandemic. While these applications are quite diverse, they all raise the same fundamental economic question, which is how do we best allocate our available limited set of scarce economic resources across the population, potentially when we have strategic agents that are trying to optimize their individual utilities within the system. And the age-old economic answer that we have to this problem is the design of so-called market mechanisms, which involves setting the rules of the marketplace, for instance, via some form of a pricing-like mechanism to ensure that the right resources go to the right groups of people, while we align agents' incentives in the process of doing so. And indeed, market mechanisms have made their ways into various aspects of our everyday lives across a range of applications, in particular for the three I pointed out on the previous slide, where electricity markets are used to allocate energy resources. Congestion pricing, as we've recently seen with New York City, is used as a mechanism to mitigate traffic congestion outcomes. And of course, a wide range of vaccine allocation mechanisms were also adopted during the pandemic. And moreover, modern day advances in computing and the proliferation of data have only opened up many new avenues for designing these market mechanisms in practice, from online advertising to a range of marketplace platforms such as Uber, Lyft, and Amazon, and more recently, even in smart mobility contexts. While the proliferation of data offers us many opportunities in terms of improving the allocation efficiency of resources, it also introduces many challenges, almost in equal measure, in the design of these market mechanisms. So for instance, market mechanisms typically geared towards efficiency maximization outcomes often end up raising quite serious fairness or equity concerns, and hence may often even remain unimplemented in practice. And the case in point of this was actually congestion pricing for traffic congestion mitigation, which was largely unimplemented until very recently in New York City, largely because of fairness and equity reasons. Moreover, data, while having the potential to improve the allocation efficiency of resources, is often plagued with uncertainty and moreover can raise quite serious privacy concerns that often render existing market mechanisms that rely on having access to complete information on user preferences and attributes as often completely inadequate for a wide range of decision-making contexts. And finally, the abundance of data also enables the easy strategic manipulation or gaming of information, also leading to a potentially new set of security challenges. So consequently, given the wide-ranging nature of some of these challenges, there's really a need for us to shift from our traditional worldview of designing market mechanisms, typically focused on efficiency maximization outcomes, to now incorporating these different societal considerations in the design of these market mechanisms. And what's interesting about incorporating these different societal considerations is that they often introduce new technical challenges. For instance, fairness and security concerns may often introduce new constraints over the allocation of resources, under which computing the optimal resource allocation strategies or the resulting equilibrium outcomes may often become computationally intractable. Moreover, with regards to privacy and uncertainty, the efficacy of typical market mechanisms often relies on having access to complete information on user preferences or attributes, but we might not really have access to that information in practice because of privacy or uncertainty-related concerns. So consequently, what we really need are new tools and methodologies to be able to address a wide variety of these technical challenges that often tend to arise when we incorporate these different societal considerations in the design of market mechanisms. And this really brings me to the core focus of the work that I've done during my PhD, which has been to leverage tools from operations research, computer science, and economics to be able to advance both the science and practice of market design for socially sustainable resource allocation, with an emphasis on large-scale sociotechnical systems. In particular, within my research, I operate within this broader worldview of social sustainability, where we're not just interested in efficiency maximization objectives, but also these other societal factors in the design of market mechanisms. And in particular, in my work, I pursue two primary research thrusts. The first is more theoretical and methodological, wherein I seek to take these important societal considerations into classical resource allocation models and develop new tools and algorithms specifically to address a wide variety of the technical challenges I raised on the previous slide. In my work, I've developed both optimization-focused approaches as well as data-driven and online learning algorithms. And the key unifying feature that I use across my research is to use tools from game theory and market design, which are necessary to capture the various strategic interactions and incentive structures of the different stakeholders typically involved in these resource allocation settings. The other key thrust that I pursue in my work is more application-driven, where I seek to take these methodological advancements to important societal applications, which have in effect also influenced my methodological work as well. In terms of applications, the core focus area of interest for me, as Marco described earlier, has been that of future mobility or transportation systems, as well as I have some work in other areas, including electricity markets and a range of settings where artificial currencies are being now increasingly incorporated into our daily lives. So with this backdrop, the focus of today's talk will be on the first two aspects of social sustainability, that of fairness and security. And in particular, we're going to be focused on addressing the computational intractabilities that often tend to arise when we incorporate fairness or security constraints in our decision-making problems. And in particular, in this talk, I'm going to highlight two key vignettes from my research agenda that are going to be focused on designing approximation algorithms for computationally hard or NP-hard problems that often tend to arise when we incorporate fairness or security constraints in our decision-making settings with an emphasis on applications in future mobility or transportation systems. The first vignette I'm going to highlight is going to be focused on fairness considerations in the context of congestion pricing, which has, of course, received a lot of attention recently, particularly given its recent deployment in New York City. And the second key vignette I'm going to focus on is on security games with an application to parking enforcement, wherein we've actually been able to apply some of our work and algorithms to real-world data sets, which we got from Stanford's Department of Public Safety on enforcing parking regulations on Stanford's campus. So I really hope that you all paid for your parking permits today. So in both of these settings, the source of the hardness is really going to come from the nature of the constraints that we imposed within both of the settings. And in both settings, we're going to develop novel convex programming relaxations for the originally NP-hard problems that we develop, which are not only computationally efficient to solve, but also give us good performance guarantees to the optimal solutions we were originally looking to solve. Okay. So here's the agenda for the rest of this talk. I'll start by going into the two key vignettes that I highlighted. First on fairness and congestion pricing, and the second on security games. And of course, if you'd like to learn about some of my other work, you can find that at my website here. And then I will end the talk by just briefly talking about some plans for the future in terms of future directions, as well as then end with acknowledgements, which hopefully would be entertaining for everyone here. So with that, let me get started with the first part on fairness in congestion pricing. I'll start by just giving a brief introduction and a motivating example. go through a model, go through some results, and then conclude. Okay. So as we all know, and probably even face today in coming to campus, traffic congestion is very much an ubiquitous problem in large urban metropolises all across the world. And a key solution that has emerged to the problem of traffic congestion has been that of congestion pricing, wherein we seek to set certain tolls on particular roads or regions within our transportation network with the hope of improving traffic congestion out. However, if we actually look at congestion pricing in practice, we realize that its real-world deployment has largely been quite limited, primarily due to fairness and equity concerns. So for instance, congestion fees have often been described as imposing a tax on the working class. And given its regressive nature, it is met with a large amount of negative public attitudes and opposition towards its deployment in practice, which has resulted in its limited adoption, barring a few special notable instances, such as Singapore, London, Stockholm, and more recently in New York City. So consequently, what we really have when it comes to congestion pricing is this clear tension between the possible efficiency gains in terms of improved congestion outcomes and the potential negative fairness or equity implications, particularly on lower income commuters. And just to highlight this tension a little further, I'm just going to give you a very simple and stylized example of a traffic routing problem. Okay, so let's suppose we want to route 5 units of travel demand between San Jose and San Francisco. And we have these 2 possible routes where the travel time on the blue route is a function of its flow given by 2x1 square, and the travel time on the green route is a fixed constant of 50. Okay. Now, in this case, let's first suppose that we do not impose any form of tolls or congestion pricing within the system. Then in this case, all users will just selfishly minimize their individual travel times within the network, resulting in a so-called user equilibrium traffic pattern, wherein all the 5 users would end up on the blue route. Know that such an outcome is a user equilibrium because no user could improve their travel times within the network by deviating to this green route within the network. Okay. However, if we look at the user equilibrium outcome more carefully, what we realize is that this outcome is quite inefficient with very high total system travel times within the network, as now we have all the 5 users using the blue route incurring a travel time of 50 each, resulting in total travel time of 250 within the system. Okay. So what we have is that user equilibrium routing without tolls is quite inefficient. So to mitigate some of these inefficiencies of user equilibrium routing, this is really where road tolling or congestion pricing may possibly have a role to play. So you could imagine that if we set the right tolls, for instance, on the blue route, we could achieve a better distribution of vehicles within the system and steer our outcomes towards a so-called system optimum, where we minimize the overall travel times of all users within the network. So in particular, you could imagine if we set the right tolls on the blue route, we could now have a setting where just 3 users use the blue route, 2 the green route, and we could significantly improve our overall travel times down from 250 to just 154 within our system. That is, we can significantly improve the efficiency of our system. However, if we investigate our system optimum outcome more carefully, what we realize is that this outcome can be perceived to be quite unfair because now we have some users, those on the green route, that are incurring almost 3 times the travel time as those on the blue route to make exactly the same trip, that is between the same origin and same destination. And typically it would be the lower income users who would have to bear the burden of the longer travel time within such systems. So consequently, what we have through this very simple and stylized example is this very clear efficiency fairness trade-off in traffic routing, where we had on one extreme the user equilibrium outcome, where we do not impose any form of tolls, which is fair because all users incur exactly the same travel times. So the ratio of the travel times of users is just 1. However, the resulting outcome may be quite inefficient with very high total travel times within the network. At the other extreme, we have the system optimum outcome, which can be induced by some form of marginal cost pricing, which is efficient by definition. However, it may lead to quite unfair outcomes, in this case, resulting in a ratio of travel times of users of almost on the order of 3. Okay. So given this efficiency fairness trade-off, this really brings me to the core contributions of this particular work, where we're going to try to resolve this efficiency fairness trade-off, which we do via a 2-step methodology. First, we propose a computationally efficient traffic routing algorithm that effectively trades off these objectives of efficiency and fairness. And we combine that with a congestion pricing scheme to actually implement our routing policy as flows in practice. And I'd like to mention that our work presents the first set of congestion pricing schemes in the context of fair routing for general road networks. Okay. And then together, our routing policy with our pricing scheme, we're able to balance these objectives of efficiency and fairness in traffic route. Okay. So with that, let me now just more concretely define the model that we're studying and the specific problem setup that we have here. So let me start by just more concretely defining what I mean by fairness and efficiency through these performance metrics that we have here. So the way we're going to think about efficiency is via a quantity called the inefficiency ratio rho, which just takes the ratio between the total travel time of a traffic assignment X, say one that is recommended by our algorithm, compared to that of the system optimum solution, which is of course the minimum achievable travel time within the system. Okay. So that's how we'll think about efficiency. The way we'll think about fairness, well, there are many ways we can define fairness within the system. For the purposes of this talk, I'm going to focus on a very specific fairness notion, which I'm going to measure via a quantity called the unfairness, U, which is going to take in a vector of path flows, and it's going to compute the following quantity, which is we're going to maximize across all origin-destination pairs of the maximum ratio of the travel times of any two users that are traveling between that origin-destination pair. Okay, so this is essentially just generalizing the ratio of travel times notion I presented with the example earlier to just a much more general class of road networks. Okay, so having defined these notions of efficiency and fairness, let me now talk about how are we going to balance these two objectives of efficiency and fairness. We're going to do this by solving a problem or studying a problem that we call the beta unfair system optimum. The way this problem will run is as follows. So we're going to minimize across all feasible traffic assignments within our system the total travel time within the network. Okay, so that's an efficiency objective that we have here. And we're going to do this while satisfying unfairness constraints that our overall level of unfairness in the network is no more than some parameter beta, where beta is a quantity you can think of as being specified by a transportation authority. Okay, just to be very clear, what our unfairness constraints are essentially saying is that no two users that are traveling between the same origin and destination can incur more than beta times the travel time of any other user if they're traveling between the same OD pair. Okay, so essentially, just to summarize, what we have here is an efficiency maximization problem or a travel time minimization problem while satisfying these fairness constraints. Now, it turns out that solving this particular problem turns out to be NP hard. And the main reason and way to see this is that these unfairness constraints end up being non-convex. So consequently, there's actually been a lot of literature in trying to develop approaches to achieve some good solutions to this particular problem. However, these existing approaches suffer from several key drawbacks. So firstly, many of these existing approaches often rely on solving large-scale mixed integer linear programs and hence are quite computationally prohibitive. Secondly, while some of these existing approaches achieve some feasible solution to this beta unfair system optimum, they often lack theoretical guarantees in terms of how good that solution is to the original problem we are looking to solve for in terms of efficiency and fairness. And finally, while these existing approaches do achieve some feasible solution to the problem in terms of coming up with a routing policy, they often do not accompany with the pricing mechanism to actually be able to induce that routing policy as flows in practice. So in this particular work, we're going to overcome each of these drawbacks by not only proposing a computationally efficient traffic routing algorithm, but combining that with robust theoretical guarantees, as well as a pricing mechanism to actually induce that outcome or routing policy as flows in practice. Okay. So let me now move into actually describing what our algorithmic approach is. So what our algorithmic approach is called is the interpolated traffic assignment, which is essentially going to take an interpolation between two different classically known traffic assignment objectives. So let me start by first just formally introducing these two traffic assignment objectives. So the first is the system optimum, where we want to minimize the overall travel time within the system. Note that this is the same as our beta unfair system optimum problem, but we've removed these non-convex unfairness constraints within this system optimum traffic assignment. Okay. Note that this problem is by definition efficient, but it may lead to quite unfair outcomes from the example that we saw earlier. At the other extreme, we have the user equilibrium traffic assignment, which is given by the solution of this convex program with this integral that we have here. Now, what's nice about the solution of this particular program is what one can show is that any two users that are traveling between the same origin and destination incur exactly the same travel time under the solution of this particular problem. So consequently, the solution of this problem is fair, but it may be quite inefficient, again, as with the example that we saw earlier. So consequently, given these two extreme outcomes that we have here, what our solution approach is what we call the interpolated traffic assignment, where we take a convex combination of the user equilibrium and the system optimum objectives. And the idea behind doing so is that we can ideally try to achieve the best of both worlds by getting the efficiency gains of the system optimum and the fairness gains of the user equilibrium by taking a convex combination of these two objectives. Okay. So let me just summarize what we have done. We started with this original NP-hard or computationally challenging beta unfair system optimum problem. And we're now approximating it with a computationally tractable convex programming relaxation, where we drop these unfairness constraints and instead replace our objective with one that interpolates between an efficiency and a fairness promoting objective. Okay. But it raises the following very natural question, which y'all have probably already asked in your heads at this point, which is how good an approximation is this ITAP that we have developed to the original NP-hard problem that we're actually looking to solve? And I'm going to answer this question both theoretically and numerically in the next few slides. Okay. So let me start with some quick theoretical results that we have on this. So I'm just going to present to you theoretical bounds that hold for general road networks for both the efficiency as well as the level of fairness within our system. So let me start with the result for efficiency. So out here, for any given convex combination parameter alpha, we can find some upper bound on the inefficiency ratio, rho, within our system, where I have the general bound at the bottom of the slide, and that bound applied to a very specific transportation network in that particular plot that I have there. Okay, so that's for efficiency. Similarly, we can also get some bounds on the unfairness. The way to read this unfairness plot is that let's suppose we desire an unfairness level of beta equals 3 within the system. Then essentially, choosing a convex combination parameter alpha anywhere between 0 to 0.5 will guarantee that we will achieve an unfairness of at most 3. And we can also show that this bound is indeed also tight. Okay. So these bounds that I have here apply to a very general class of road networks. But in fact, if we focus on a very special class of road networks, that of Pigou networks, with just a single origin, a single destination, and 2 roads connecting the origin to the destination, which is in fact the same as the example that I started with this talk, we can actually establish a much stronger guarantee. In particular, what we can show for such Pigou networks is that our ITAP approach actually achieves the optimal solution to the beta unfair SO problem if we just restrict to this class of networks within our problem setting. Okay. So that's pretty much everything I want to say from a theoretical viewpoint on this particular work. Let me now move to some numerical experiments that we also ran in comparing our algorithm to a state-of-the-art approach. And out here, I'm depicting a table of comparing our algorithm to the state-of-the-art on 6 different transportation networks that we ran our algorithm. And what you can clearly see here from this particular table is that our algorithm is actually several orders of magnitude faster compared to that of the state-of-the-art. And one way to see why our algorithm is so computationally efficient, it really stems from the following key fact, which you all have probably taken in your Calc 101 courses back in undergrad, is that if we take our interpolated traffic assignment objective by the fundamental theorem of calculus, we can just transform it into a user equilibrium traffic assignment objective with just a modified travel time function. And because we have very efficient algorithms to solve the user equilibrium, we can now just port that over to developing very efficient algorithms for the interpolated traffic assignment as well. And that's really what gets us these computational efficiency gains. Okay. So that's great from a computational viewpoint, but the question is how well do we actually do compared to that other algorithm if we actually compare them in terms of the 2 key performance metrics that we're looking to solve for, efficiency and fairness. So out here, I'm depicting the Pareto frontiers of the inefficiency ratio to the level of unfairness of our algorithm depicted in blue to the state-of-the-art benchmark depicted in red for the same 6 transportation networks. And the key takeaway from these plots is that take any desirable level of unfairness, which is typically in the low unfairness regime where we would want to operate within practice. Our algorithm actually achieves lower total travel times or better efficiencies compared to that of the state-of-the-art benchmark. And moreover, if you just look at the first 3 transportation networks, take any level of unfairness, our approach does better than the benchmark, no matter which level of fairness that we choose within the system. Okay. So let me just summarize everything we've seen so far. So we developed this computationally tractable convex programming relaxation, ITAP, for this original problem we're looking to solve for. I showed you that it's computationally efficient. We presented some theoretical bounds to analyze how well it does to the original problem we wanted to solve. And moreover, I showed you that we can get better numerical performance compared to a benchmark approach. But it still leaves open the following key question, which is while ITAP achieves a good solution to the original problem we're looking to solve for, well, we have a routing policy in place now, but can we actually implement this routing policy as flows in practice through some form of congestion prices? Okay, and I'm going to exactly try to answer this question in the next slide. Okay. So in particular, to derive the congestion pricing that we're going to have here, I'm going to assume the following model of user behavior, how users were optimized within the system. And we're going to assume that users are just going to minimize some combination of their travel time and tolls. Okay. And in particular, the functional form I'm going to assume is that users are minimizing their value of time multiplied by their travel time plus the tolls that they spend within the system. And this is just a very standard form that's often assumed in the traffic routing literature. For the simplicity of this talk, I'm going to assume we have homogeneous users. So all users have the same value of time. And I'll normalize the value of time to 1. So all users are just minimizing the sum of their travel time and tolls. And I'll mention what we can do in the heterogeneous setting in just a bit. Okay. So now we know what users are optimizing within our system. Now let's see how can we derive a pricing policy through our interpolated traffic assignment objective. Well, recall our objective as earlier. And recall by the fundamental theorem of calculus that we can recast it as a user equilibrium problem with a modified travel time function. Okay. Now, if we do an optimality analysis or a KKT analysis of this user equilibrium problem with this modified travel time objective, we get the following key fact, that if there is any path that has a positive flow on it, then the following quantity must be minimal for that particular origin destination pair, which is essentially just the sum of the travel times plus this additional delta term. And now, if we compare the two travel costs on the two ends of the slide, if we set the tolls to be exactly equal to this additional delta term, then that's exactly the tolls that we want to set to achieve our outcome, the routing policy we're recommending via ITAP as an equilibrium flow in practice. Okay. And for those of you much more familiar with the traffic routing community, you'll note that this additional delta term is what we refer to in our paper as interpolated marginal cost tolls, as it just takes the convex combination parameter alpha and multiplies it with the standard marginal cost tolling term. Okay, so this is for the setting of homogeneous users, but what can we do for the heterogeneous user setting? I won't go into details on it here, but I'll just mention that we can actually derive a linear programming-based methodology to be able to also extend some of this analysis and results even to the heterogeneous user setting. It won't look like this interpolated marginal cost tolling term anymore, but it'll take a different form, but we can also do that, which we do in the paper. Okay. So let me just conclude on this first part of the talk. So in this work, we developed a novel convex program that trades off these objectives of efficiency and fairness. It has several key benefits, and moreover, yields a very natural class of congestion pricing schemes. And moreover, I'd like to highlight that we also study various extensions within the paper to other notions of unfairness than the one that I presented within this talk. Okay. I just also want to mention that while I focused on this approach that we've developed on developing a convex programming relaxation to this NP-hard fairness constraint traffic assignment problem, this is, of course, just part of my much broader agenda on studying equitable congestion pricing, which has been a core theme of much of my PhD. So in fact, we've studied this problem in a variety of different ways. So in another work, we think of congestion pricing, not just from the lens of road tolling, but also from the lens of, can we use these collected toll revenues to potentially give refunds to the right groups of users within the population to improve equity outcomes? And in fact, in the game theoretic frameworks that we study, we show that if we design these refunding schemes appropriately, we can provably improve system efficiency without worsening the level of wealth inequality within the system. And moreover, in some more recent work, we've also provided some, developed some game theoretic frameworks to provide some policy insights regarding the optimal design of a variety of recent equitable congestion pricing implementations that have started to take place in the San Francisco Bay Area, namely that of credit and discount-based congestion pricing, which are essentially designed to provide subsidies to low-income users to be able to access tolled roads, particularly express lanes on highways. Okay. So with that, that sort of concludes the first part of this talk. I'll just pause here in case there are any quick questions that I should address. Or any on Zoom as well. I don't see any questions, so. Okay, I guess I will then move on. So that sort of concludes the first part of this talk on fairness and congestion pricing. And now I will continue our theme of developing these approximation algorithms for computationally challenging problems by focusing on the second key vignette of this talk, which is going to be on security games with an application to parking enforcement. Okay, so I'll start with a brief introduction, go through our model, our results, both theoretical and numerical, and then conclude. Okay, so as we all know, fraud is very much ubiquitous and can lead to quite detrimental consequences. So take, for instance, environmental noncompliance. Well, in this case, water treatment facilities often may have the incentive to save on the costs of complying with water quality regulations. However, doing so can possibly put the lives of residents at risk that the water treatment facility is potentially serving. Take an example that we face almost on a daily basis, one maybe that you faced today when you came to campus, which is we may often want to engage in illegal parking practices, for instance, whether we should purchase parking permits on a given day or not, or maybe even engage in overspeeding. However, doing so can possibly result in increased traffic jams and maybe even compromise the safety of our roads. While the applications where frauds can occur can be indeed quite diverse, users are typically engaging in fraud to be able to strategically obtain some benefit that would otherwise not have been attainable had they operated within the bounds of lawful conduct. And it is this exact strategic interaction that we're going to aim to capture within this work. Okay. So the prevalence of fraud and its potentially detrimental consequences raises indeed a key security challenge and requires effective enforcement through the form of policing, which also poses a very natural resource allocation problem. The way we'll think about this resource allocation problem is as follows. So let's say we have a police authority with access to a certain set of police officers or enforcement officers, and we have potentially susceptible nodes or locations in the system. Think of these as the different water treatment facilities across California. And then the question we want to ask is, how do we best allocate our available set of security officers across the different water treatment facilities to achieve a potentially good outcome, for instance, one where now more facilities are complying with water quality regulations? Or alternatively, we could also frame this problem in the context of enforcing parking regulations on Stanford's campus as how do we best allocate our available police officers across the different parking lots, for instance, on Stanford's campus, to achieve a good outcome, for instance, one where more commuters are now purchasing parking permits. To be able to answer this question, we're going to study this problem as a security game, which is going to be played between users and an administrator that has access to a budget of security resources. And a key aspect of this game is that in alignment with many of these practical applications, the administrator can levy fines on users that are found engaging in fraud. Okay. So just an overview of the contributions. So we're first going to study this game theoretically by studying what do the equilibrium outcomes within this game look like under a range of informational assumptions and under two different administrator objectives, that of revenue and payoff maximization. I'll be very clear what I mean by these terms in the coming few slides. Okay, just a quick preview of the nature of the results that we get. So it'll turn out that computing the optimal solutions to these problems ends up being NP hard. However, we can resort to developing approximation algorithms for which we can get certain approximation ratios, as well as some resource augmentation style guarantees, which I will also present. Okay, so that's everything that I'll present to you on the theoretical front. But we also do some numerical experiments based on real world data that I got from Stanford's Department of Public Safety, which is in charge of enforcing parking regulations on Stanford's campus. And then finally, we also study a variety of key extensions to this particular model. And while I won't have the time to go into these extensions today, I'd be happy to talk about that more offline. Okay, a very quick note on related literature. So compared to much of the prior work on security games, the way our work really contributes is that our work really provides the first set of algorithms for which we have provable performance guarantees for this very general class of Stackelberg security games known as multi-resource Bayesian Stackelberg security games. Okay, I'll just clarify what I mean by multi-resource and Bayesian here. The Bayesian refers to the fact that the adversary within our system, that is the users, can have many possible types. And the multi-resource refers to the fact that the administrator has a budget of security resources to prevent fraud rather than just having a single security resource. Okay, so this really just generalizes the typical class of games in the security games literature that are generally studied, for which we can get provable performance guarantees within this work. Okay, so let me now formally introduce the model that we study. So we have an administrator with these R security resources, and we have these L locations. Think of these as the different parking lots on Stanford's campus that are susceptible to fraud. And now each location L will be characterized by some type theta, which is given by a triple. Lambda Li represents the number of users of type I at location L. DLI represents the benefit that users receive from engaging in fraud. For instance, how much savings you get from not purchasing a parking permit on a given day. And then PLI represents the administrator's payoff from reducing fraud at a given location, which you can think of as the amount of earnings the administrator receives from parking permit or purchases on campus in a particular parking lot on a given day. Okay. A key feature of our model is that the administrator, as a penalty to users, can levy a fine of K if users are found engaging in fraud. And this is, as you would expect, say, in a parking enforcement application, you would be issued a citation if you're found engaging in fraud. Okay. Within our game, what do the strategies of the users and the administrator look like? So, well, the administrator strategy within our game is going to be given by a mixed strategy vector sigma to allocate its budget of security resources across the different locations, where sigma L just represents the probability of allocating a resource to a given location, where the sum of the sigmas must be no more than our available budget R. Okay, so that's the administrator's strategy, sigma, that it can choose. What about the user strategy space? Well, in response to the administrator strategy sigma, users are simply just going to decide, should I engage in fraud or not, depending on the chosen strategy sigma. Okay, and to represent that, I'm going to use a term YLI of sigma to denote the probability that the user of type I at location L engages in fraud, given that the administrator plays a strategy sigma. Okay, so these are going to be the two different strategy spaces for both these users. And given these strategies, we can finally define the objectives that we're interested in studying within this work. And specifically, we're going to study two objectives, that of revenue and payoff maximization. Okay. Let me start by just introducing the revenue maximization objective, because we'll mainly focus on this within this work. So within this talk, essentially, the revenue maximization objective can be formulated as a bi-level program, where in the upper level, we're trying to maximize by selecting some enforcement strategy sigma, the overall revenues that we get from fine collections. While in the lower level, users are best responding to the chosen strategy sigma by deciding whether or not to engage in fraud, depending on whether the gains outweigh the losses from fraud. Okay, so that's the revenue maximization objective or bi-level program that we have. Analogously, we can also formulate a payoff maximization bi-level program, which is essentially entirely analogous to the revenue maximization one, other than that now we choose a different objective, that of payoff maximization rather than revenue maximization. Okay, I won't go too much more into the details on these class of objectives, which I'd be happy to do go into more offline. But I do want to mention that both these objectives have practical relevance depending on the specific setting that we are studying. So what is our goal, having defined both of these objectives? Our goal is to characterize what are the optimal or near optimal solutions of these bi-level programs look like, which is to essentially study equilibrium formation within our game under these two different administrator objectives. Okay. And to answer this question, let me move to the next part of this talk, where I'll go into some of our theoretical results. Okay, let me just briefly preview the results that we get, which can really be summarized by this 2x2 grid that I have here. So we have these two different objectives, and we're going to study this under two different informational assumptions, that of homogeneous and heterogeneous types. Let me be very clear what I mean by homogeneous and heterogeneous. So homogeneous here represents the fact that the user type can vary across locations, but at a given location, all users have exactly the same type. Okay. The heterogeneous setting just generalizes that to say that even at a given location, we can have many possible types of users. Okay. So what are the results that we get? It turns out that homogeneous revenue maximization is actually easy in that we can develop a polynomial time greedy algorithm to compute the optimal strategy of the administrator. However, it turns out that homogeneous payoff maximization ends up being NP hard. That is, it's very computationally challenging, but we can develop some approximation algorithms. In fact, we can develop a greedy algorithm that can get us half of the optimal payoff of the payoff maximizing administrator. And moreover, what we can also show is a resource augmentation style guarantee, which is that if we augment our greedy algorithm with just one additional resource, we would get at least the payoff as the optimal strategy without that additional resource. Okay? So that's for the homogeneous setting. What about the more interesting heterogeneous setting? So it turns out that while homogeneous revenue maximization is polynomial time solvable, heterogeneous revenue maximization is NP hard. However, we can still develop similar approximation and resource augmentation style guarantees as we did for the homogeneous payoff maximization setting, even in the heterogeneous revenue maximization one. And moreover, each of these results actually very naturally ports over to the heterogeneous payoff maximization setting as well. Okay. Now, I won't have time to go into all of these results, so I will focus on the heterogeneous revenue maximization in the next few slides, just to give you some more intuition on the results and the algorithms that we have involved here. Okay, so let's start with the first claim that heterogeneous revenue maximization is computationally challenging, or NP hard. And to see this, I'm just going to give you some geometric intuition. Okay, to build your geometric intuition, we're interested in solving this revenue maximization bi-level program. So it's instructive to first study what does the solution of the lower level problem of our bi-level program look like, given that the administrator is maximizing revenue. That is, what does the best response function of users look like? Well, what's nice is that we can show that this best response function just takes a simple threshold rule. What this means is that if the administrator's allocation or enforcement probability to a given location exceeds a certain threshold, users will stop engaging in fraud. Otherwise, they will engage in fraud, right? And this is naturally what you would expect to even happen, let's say, in practice. Okay, now that we have the best response function of users, let's do a quick warm up by looking at what does a revenue function look like at a given location in the setting of homogeneous types of users. That is, we just have a single type of users at any given location. Okay. What we can show is that this revenue function essentially increases up to this threshold, after which the revenue drops to 0 as users stop engaging in fraud. Okay. So what's nice about this revenue function is that it's continuous between the range of 0 and our threshold, which enables us to derive a polynomial time algorithm to be able to solve the homogeneous revenue maximization problem. Okay. However, let's look at what does our revenue function now look like in the heterogeneous setting where we have many possible types of users at any given location. Well, it turns out that our revenue function no longer looks as nice, and it in fact takes a much more jagged form. And the reason for this is the fact that now we have many possible types of users at a given location. And as a result, there are different threshold probabilities at which these different types of users move from engaging to not engaging in fraud, which results in a revenue function that's highly discontinuous and potentially non-monotone. And this is really what we can use to be able to show that the heterogeneous revenue maximization problem is indeed NP hard. Okay. So what this means is that directly solving or optimizing for the revenue function is challenging because of these issues of discontinuity and non-monotonicity. But can we possibly optimize some approximation of this revenue function that can be tractably solved and still yields a good approximation to the original problem? And so the key idea that we leverage or sort of use here is that we essentially take the concave upper closure of our revenue function, or what we call within our work as the monotone concave upper approximation, or MCUA for short. And what's nice about this concave upper closure is that it can be optimized tractably, primarily because this concave upper closure can just be optimized via a greedy procedure that just orders the segments of the slopes of this MCUA in the descending order of the slopes of those segments. And then this is really going to be the key subroutine to devise our algorithm, which I won't go into detail in the interest of time. But what we can show about this algorithm is that this algorithm can get us at least half of the optimal payoff, half of the optimal revenue as that of the revenue maximizing administrator. And moreover, we can also get a resource augmentation result, which is that if we augment this algorithm with just one additional resource, you would get at least the revenue as that of the optimal solution without that additional resource. Okay. So that's pretty much everything I wanted to present to you from a theoretical viewpoint in today's talk. Let me just go into some numerical experiments. So as I mentioned, we got some real world data from Stanford's Department of Public Safety to be able to actually test some of our algorithms on their data sets. Let me just quickly tell you about the setup of the problem. So all commuters are required to purchase parking permits when they come to Stanford's campus. And if you're found violating a regulation, you're typically issued a parking citation or a parking fee. Okay. And a key aspect of this problem is that any collected citation fees goes to the county, but any earnings from parking permit purchases goes to Stanford. And this is going to be a key aspect that we're going to use to be able to model this problem within our frame. Okay. What is the data that we got? We have 7 months of data between September 2022 to March 2023, which includes enforcement information on the times and periods at which enforcement took place, as well as citation information on the number of citations that were issued in the different parking lots in given month. Okay. So given the setup, we're going to formulate Stanford's parking enforcement problem as what we refer to in our work as the heterogeneous payoff maximization problem, where the payoffs represent the earnings that Stanford receives from parking permit purchases. Note that any collected sort of earnings all go to Stanford, but citation fees go to the county. Okay, so what are the results that we get? So we actually test our model with several different counterfactuals of user behavior. And out here, I'm just plotting the fraction of the total permit earnings that are received compared to the proportion of strategic users of our algorithm depicted in orange to the state of the art or the status quo that is currently in place on Stanford's campus depicted in blue. And you can see that regardless of the proportion of strategic users, our algorithm achieves better permit earnings compared to the status quo. And moreover, the gains that our algorithm has increases, particularly as the proportion of strategic users in the population increases, which is expected primarily because that's where the power of our security game framework really lies as we capture the strategic interactions of users. A quick note that I want to make is that if we actually look at the status quo number of citations that are issued in practice, what we can actually show using the data that we have is that we can actually achieve $300,000 of additional permit earnings every year relative to the status quo enforcement mechanism. Okay. So let me quickly conclude. So in this work, we studied this multi-resource Bayesian Stackelberg security game. We studied a variety of different algorithms for both the revenue and payoff maximization objectives that we studied, as well as we did some experiments based on a case study of Stanford's parking enforcement system. Also, I do want to again highlight that we do have a variety of model extensions that we also study in the paper, and I'm happy to talk about that more offline. Okay. So with that, that pretty much concludes the technical part of this talk. Within this talk, I highlighted to you two key sort of aspects of my research agenda, particularly focused on designing approximation algorithms for computationally challenging or NP-hard problems that arise when we incorporate these fairness or security constraints. The first key vignette I focused on was on fairness and congestion pricing, the second on security gain. Okay. Let me now just briefly end by talking about some future directions, and then I'll leave some time for Q&A before going into the acknowledgements. So, of course, what I presented to you today on looking at, primarily looked at the fairness and security concerns from the lens of approximation algorithms, but this is, of course, just part of my much broader agenda on studying socially sustainable resource allocation, both from a methodological as well as an applied perspective. So what's my vision moving forward? Well, much of the work that I've done during my PhD, including the two works that I presented to you today, largely looks at these different concepts of social sustainability, be it fairness, security, or privacy, largely in isolation of each other. However, a key aspect that we need to really think about if we want to deploy any of our algorithms or mechanisms in practice is how can we combine some of these social sustainability concepts potentially in tandem with each other, as that's often what is needed if we want to deploy our mechanisms, because practitioners are often dealing with a variety of these social sustainability concepts, often in tandem in their real-world decision-making processes. And in order to do this, this is really going to rely on me continuing to build on my several key fundamental building blocks, both from a methodological as well as an applied perspective. Okay, let me be a bit more concrete about specific future directions that I have in mind. So one area that I'm quite excited about is that if we think about the two games or the two projects that I presented today, for instance, the one on fairness and congestion pricing, for us to derive the fair congestion pricing schemes, we required access to complete information on what the origin destination pairs of users are, what their values of time or preferences are. However, we might not actually have access to all of that information in practice in many of these contexts. And so key aspect in that regard is to integrate notions from dynamics and learning into some of these more static game theoretic models that I presented to you today, particularly, for instance, those focused on fairness and security settings. I do want to note that I have a third strand of work, which I did not present today, which does address some of these issues in a different class of equilibrium pricing problems in studying issues of privacy and uncertainty across equilibrium pricing settings. However, even with some of that work, for us to be able to get strong performance guarantees in those settings, we assume access to some form of structure on the input. For instance, that the input is drawn IID from some distribution for us to get some strong performance guarantees. However, of course, real-world data sets are often non-IID, and so key aspect that we want to think about is how can we generalize our mechanisms under these potential outliers that we may have to deal with. And this is really where I feel that maybe leveraging some emerging techniques, for instance, from generative AI, could really play a key role. And in fact, we have some ongoing work within the lab on our transportation networks in trying to address this exact point. And finally, a key aspect that I'm extremely excited about is to study much broader definitions of social sustainability. So much of the work I presented in today's talk focused on, say, the first half was on equitable congestion pricing, but it focuses on single mode mobility systems where cars are the only mode of transport. So key aspect I'm interested in thinking about is how can we think about these equity considerations in these multimodal mobility settings, for instance, those that we might encounter in developing nation contexts, or even within the evolving mobility landscape where we have increased introduction of autonomous vehicles, urban air mobility, and so on within our transportation networks. So with that, let me just pause here in case anybody in the audience or online have any questions, and then I'll just move into the acknowledgements in the remaining time. Yes.
So for the practical case study of like the parking enforcement at Stanford, what are some of the knobs you can turn in terms of like, is it like the price of like the permits, like the type of permits, or like where the enforcers go? Like what are the parameters in there?
Great. So in that setting, we're assuming that the price of the permits, the fines, everything is fixed. The thing that you can tune is where do you place your where do you deploy your resources, right? So if you recall the mixed strategy vector sigma that I had for the administrator, that's essentially telling us the probability of allocating resources to a given location, right? So that is the knob that you can turn. So that's the knob that we are turning within this case. Yeah.
Yeah, how do you actually practically apply some of these algorithms? So as a total layperson, does this mean like price discrimination and different users, end users getting charged different fees for basically parking, for congestion? Is that the result of the work here?
Yeah, that's a great point. So actually in the first, so actually the second project does not have any component of pricing. It's more just purely an allocation, resource allocation style problem. The first project I presented indeed had a pricing component, but in that case, if you recall the interpolated marginal cost pricing scheme that I presented, if any two users are using a particular road, they're going to pay exactly the same price on that road, right? So from that perspective, it's not discriminatory. So yeah, hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah, could you extend it to add more things around price discrimination?
Oh, absolutely. So actually, like some of the other works that I briefly presented in my broader agenda on equitable congestion pricing indeed do some flavor of that. Yes, exactly. So for instance, recently in the Bay Area, they've deployed these discount-based congestion pricing mechanisms. So if you're below a certain income level, they're giving you like a 50% discount to be able to use express lanes. So that's a form of discriminatory pricing, which we also study. Yeah, Stephen.
It was a great presentation. I really liked the terminology that you used of the migration of a person from a greedy individual to a strategic individual, because we've all been that person, right? We have a citation to change our behavior. So what are your assumptions here about, I know you said this sort of as a ratio, but what are your assumptions here in a practical sense of how many citations somebody would get per unit time before they convert?
I see. So that's a great question. And I think that brings a bit more of the timescale component into this problem. So actually the work I presented on security games, actually both the works I presented are single shot games, right? So there is no notion of learning within these games, which sort of I was trying to get at in the future work aspect. That, but that's a great point in terms of how can we extend some of these settings to say the one that you're talking about, how can we induce changes in behavior? Say you have a certain threshold probability today at which you're going to engage in fraud, but maybe that changes because of you receiving more citations or sort of just the dynamics of the system changing over time. So that's definitely not modeled in the current work. Yes. Great.
Question online.
Okay.
The experiment section of part 2, you show a plot where the x-axis is the percentage of strategic users. The algorithm does not need knowledge of this value. Is that correct? And does it compute a solution assuming all users are strategic? And if so, do you think that there's room to improve if you do give the algorithm information on the percentage of strategic users?
Oh, I see, I see. Yes, so that's a great point. Indeed. So the algorithm is using knowledge of the proportion of strategic users within the population. But you can also do a counterfactual analysis where you can relax that in saying that you just have some prior on what this what the number of strategic users are. And again, it depends on how robust your prior is, but that'll influence, of course, the extent to which your guarantees hold. But I think it shouldn't change things too much as long as the degree of uncertainty is not very high. Yeah. But Matt, we can also talk about this more offline as well. So yeah.